pandemic situation, or I mean, pandemic situation now and post-pandemic future. Let me say a few words about our speaker. Alexander is act now Sorkin visiting professor at Williams College and is also associate at the Davis Center in Harvard. But beginning in July, he will be assistant professor at the Department of National Security Affairs in the Naval Postgraduate School in Monterey, California. So we'll be moving to California very soon. And he had a PhD from Cornell University. He went to King's College London, so really international trajectory. Alexander, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us for this event. I will give you the floor for about 30 minutes maximum, and then we will open for a discussion. I invite everybody to ask questions in the chat box that you can see on the right of your screen. And then I will try, because we may have a lot of people, so if there are a lot of questions, I will be collecting questions and moderating the discussion by organizing the questions, so Alexander has enough time to try to answer to each of you. So once again, welcome, and Alexander, welcome, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Marlene, and thank you for the invitation. It's really great to be able to talk about these issues and not really about the pandemic. It's just kind of tangential. There's other news apart from that, and so it's really a pleasure to do this. So what I'll do is actually kind of provide this really broad brush discussion of popular opinion trends in Russia and their significance. And in particular, in line with several things that are going on before this crisis we're in now globally. One was this economic, political stagnation that was occurring in Russia before that. The big other process that was going on is the extension of Putin's rule beyond 2024, which is supposed to be his last constitutional term in office. And really now with this ongoing crisis, which is hitting Russia pretty hard, what that might mean in the context of these public opinion trends. So what I'll do is provide a broad introduction to some of the dynamics of Russia's public opinion, really in a fashion wrapped up in a not too technical fashion, so it can have more kind of policy relevance, if you like, in a lot of senses. So excuse me if I don't go into too much detail with a lot of these graphs, and there'll be a lot of opportunity, I presume, during the Q&A to expand on some of these. For that reason, what I wanted to do is I just wanted to mention some research that I'll draw on this talk if you're kind of more interested in the specifics of the research. So really, a lot of it is coming from a book chapter that I for a book that is just out, and I highly recommend, Citizens in the State and Authoritarian Regimes. It's actually comparing Russia and China. So it's a comparative project in this sense. And another one that is forthcoming, hopefully, if things don't slow down too much during the kind of pandemic crisis. So this is a book manuscript that I have forthcoming that is looking at essentially the public opinion trends and how they drive dynamics in authoritarian regimes, especially electoral democracy. So this is broader than Russia, but some of these more theoretical trends I'll kind of touch on, drawn from there. But what I'll do, and just to introduce this dynamic, is really start with the question, why is popular opinion important in a place like Russia? Russia is supposedly an authoritarian system, and we're kind of conditioned to think that people cannot genuinely support these regimes. So why would people's voting behavior, approval rates, and things like that be important? We assume that populations are coerced, bribed, or brainwashed into supporting these regimes, essentially. So this whole idea is a bit counterintuitive. Well, one thing, if you look historically, is election and mass protests matter in Russia. The system cannot control the population with repressive measures alone, to put it in a nutshell. And essentially, the system is not an ideological totalitarian system like the Soviet Union that could have this compelling ideology to people, or keep people under control, complete control of the media and things like that. So it's essentially, you might think of electoral legitimation as a sort of a compensation mechanism. You essentially win a share of the population, and essentially the losers can be placated to this democratic mandate. And also, you cannot falsify elections without backlash. Most falsification, there's sophisticated analysis. There's election forensics analysis that look into election fraud in Russia say basically that most falsification is really to make up in Russia for apathetic supporters of the regime who just don't turn out on the to vote. So that's about 10 to 15% on average, and in recent years it's increased. So it really matters in that sense as a mechanism for sustaining the system. Another one is that is essential presidential popularity in particular is a key tool for controlling the elites in Russia. A highly popular leader, on one hand, can shield Russia's, highly corrupt and widely despised elites, especially economic elites, from persecution, and also the bureaucracy from persecution in exchange for their loyalty. At the same time, a Russian leader can use popularity to discipline disloyal elites. And cases that come to mind here are the cases of Khodorkovsky, Berezovsky, Businski, the media and other oligarchs that were purged essentially in the beginning of Putin's reign. So essentially, these are despised elites. So every time Putin goes against them, he's only going to become more popular for those. So popularity, in a sense, is giving him the leverage to control elites in that ways. And finally, you might argue that the loss of commanding heights in popularity can lead to a cascade of defections and protests. So popularity is a signal of staying power in a system based on patronage and clientelism. So an unpopular leadership opens to challenge by outsiders or through elite defections. So if a leader is popular, that's a signal for a lot of these corrupt elites that they'll be there, the leader will be there tomorrow to uphold their end of the bargain in terms of this the dynamic of patronage and sustainment power and so on. So if popularity goes down, you have this possibility of things might have the property of having a run on the bank, people abandoning the regime in terms of both the elites and the population. So it's essential. So you might argue popularity in a sense is a kind of essential, not the only, of course, factor in this dynamic, is what is kind of essential because a lot of these other mechanisms, arguments, and factors really channel their effects on regime stability through popularity. So that's just in a nutshell why that's the case. And really starting now with one of the key metrics in terms of popularity. This is Vladimir Putin's approval, the most obsessively watched thing. So this is how they look since August '99 when he first appears in the Russian scene in a public sense. So just a couple of indicators here. One, he was an instant star. So basically he had a 0 to 80% approval after the Chechnya invasion in 1999. So between August and November 1999, his popularity really explodes. His popularity really never drops below 60% until now. So this was the low ceiling for popularity. And it reached up to over 80% after the Crimean annexation in sustained fashion. The average was about 75%. So just to give perspective on this, US presidents average at about 51% over the course of their tenures, which is about 25% lower than Putin's rates. And so this is essentially the supermajority, if you like, in terms of popular standing in Russia that granted domination over institutions and elites in the case of Putin. And bear in mind the relative differences are huge as well. If you check any other politician or any public figure in Russia, their ratings are going to be much lower. So this towering popularity really gave this supermajority sense that demobilized protests and any opposition and put everything in control of elites and institutions. So a couple of myths here that I want to talk about. So one is that Putin's popularity is not real, but is faked. That people live in this authoritarian system where essentially the press can just stay in the local. Well, a lot of ways to show that's not the case. One is a neat instrument called a list experiment. It is done in surveys. It's a survey technique to estimate the percentage of people who falsify their responses. So this is from a Russian electoral study in 2012, and it compares a self-reported vote in red, the direct question, how many people would vote for Putin, versus the list experiment, which is the estimate genuine vote. It has this error bar, the black thing that you see there. So what this shows essentially is that only about 6 to 9% falsely report they voted for Putin. which when you put it in perspective, Putin's vote ranges between 60 and 90% across various elections. Here it's among all people, not just those who voted, so that's why the percentages are lower. These percentages are insignificant. There's a number of studies beyond the Russia election study 2012, which have repeated this survey, essentially, to see how much there is a discrepancy between the self-reported and the estimated general. So this is the indirect way to look at it. So by and large, Russian support for Putin is very genuine for others. So that's a key thing to keep in mind. Another myth, and this is where things get interesting, is that Putin is popular because people think he brought prosperity and is effectively solving Russia's problems. So there is some truth to that, but the reality is far more complicated. So I'll kind of illustrate this with one pattern. This is a survey question asked in 2012, and the same patterns you can see actually in 2008 and 2016. So it's kind of very consistent. So this is asking people, in the years since Putin first became president, have the following issues increased, decreased, or remain unchanged? So in red you have increased, in change, in green, blue is decreased. So these are the 8 functional areas where a Russian president should deliver. So global influence of Russia, political stability, stability in the North Caucasus, income inequality, corruption of state officials, standard of living, responsiveness of the state, and personal freedom. So starting with the global influence of Russia, about a little less than 60% say it increased under Putin. Those 12 years there. But then, and that's kind of a net positive, even though not overwhelming. So, political stability in Russia is less than 50% that it increased. And this is one of the main selling points of Putin here. And it's below 50%. Stability in the North Caucasus, this is the thing that actually brought him into power and made him popular, actually in terms of approval. Less than 50% as well. Income inequality, over 71% of Russians said it increased under Putin. Corruption of state officials, over 50% say it increased. And when you know how bad things were in the 90s, these are horrible figures. Standard of living, another major selling point for Putin's regime, just 33% of Russians say it increased. So this is abysmally bad. Responsiveness of the state, same thing. Personal freedom in Russia, even worse. So if you zoom out here and ask the same respondents how many of them would vote for Putin, over 70% of the respondents in the same survey would say that they vote for Putin, even though they have this pretty horrible grades they have given for actual performance. So this tells you a couple of things. One, it tells you more directly that people are not lying they support Putin, because they would also falsify their assessments of Putin. You know, if they're saying, you know, if they're lying that they approve of Putin, they will also lie that things are great under them. You have this kind of very interesting discrepancy here, which is really a key concept. And what it raises here as a question is, how is Putin so popular when people assess his performance so poorly? Here's another stab at the same issue. So this one asks Russians, why do you think people trust Putin? Why so many people are supportive of Putin? And it's really interesting that his performance has a very low share of the reasons why they do that. So in blue here, we have people are convinced that Putin successfully and adequately tackles Russia's problems. So when you look at this, is essentially your performance instruments. Only between about 20 and 30%, rises up to 40 at one point after Crimea, say that they support him because of he delivers essentially on solving Russia's problems. More people actually. And when you kind of look at the peaks and trials, the performance legitimacy peaked around the time when he switched with Medvedev and then with annexation of Crimea, and it declined when he announced the return to presidency, the protest wave in 2011-12, and the reset of the presidential term limits going on just now. But when you look at other factors that why people support him, you'll have people hope that Putin will be able to deal with the country's problems in the future, which is always higher, essentially, than performance legitimacy. It's about 30–40%. And similarly, people don't see anybody else they can rely on. So this, 2/3 of Putin's support is hope and fear. And let me put it in another perspective. So performance legitimacy and actual delivering on solving Russia's problems has always been about a third of the reasons why people support. And this is crucial for understanding the logic of his approval. So what drives Putin's popular approval? And what I argue in the book manuscript, support company, is really the trauma of the 90s and the stability imperative. And when kind of Russia was going through essentially what's the biggest peacetime decline in history and the potentially collapse, and the trauma of that and the type of leader Putin. So let me break it down for a moment. This is actually what I think is the most important survey series to understand what happened in Russia since the 90s. So this is a question asking people, are there in such situations when our nation needs a strong and imperious leader, a strong hand? Good thing about this question, it was asked since November '89, essentially the date of the collapse of the Berlin Wall. And you have three substantive responses here. One in red, our people always need a strong hand. So it's the straight out authoritarian answer. A second one is this contingent authoritarian. There are situations like now when you should answer to other powers in the hands of one person. It's in green. In blue, you have the straight liberal answer. You should never give one person the full command. So just look at how things looked in November '89. In November '89, the blue was 44.8%. That's almost 45% of Russians gave a straight out liberal answer. You should never concentrate power in the hands of one person, which is amazing. After 71 years of a totalitarian communist dictatorship, a majority of the Russian population just had the liberal politics. Only about 25% gave the straight out authoritarian answer, we always need a strong hand, and about 15% gave this really. What happened afterwards was this biggest socioeconomic and political decline in history. Soviet collapse, the '93 constitutional crisis when Yeltsin shelled parliament and things looked like Russia's going to break apart. '94 financial crisis, the first Chechen war, and essentially look at what happened. The trends flip. Now you have about 31%, 32 almost percent going to the straight authoritarian answer, we always need a strong hand, and liberal responses dropping severely. Then we have the second round of the Russian crisis, '98 financial crisis, NATO bombed Russia's ally Serbia, and Russia's powerless to support it, and the second Chechen war. And essentially you have a complete flip of these trends. And this doesn't change much under Putin. This sentiment was set up for him much before he appears on the scene, pretty much around '95. So a couple of things you can draw from here. One, there's no propaganda effect in this demand for a strong leader. This preceded Putin by 5 years. Nobody knew who Putin was in '95 when these trends flipped, when people desired somebody like him. Another thing conclusion you could draw is that Russians are not culturally predisposed to authoritarianism. This is a kind of a situational reaction to difficult circumstances and the breakdown of what they thought was democracy. And they supported authoritarian rule when democracy failed catastrophically. Putin, someone like Putin was demanded by the population years before he appeared. So he's kind of riding on this popular sentiment that was set up in the 90s. So this is crucial to understand his behavior. And when you look at his approval, you see how central it is in terms of his appeal. So when you look at the slogans, for instance, one of the favorite slogans has been raising Russia from its knees. It's been a slogan throughout his presidency. Then in 2012, this poster here says strong leader for a great country. In 2018, they updated the picture, the same message, strong president, strong Russia. And one particularly interesting statement, Vyacheslav Volodin, the famous speaker, has said, while Putin is here, so is Russia. When Putin is gone, so is Russia. So this stability is essentially his main. It's not delivering on specific performances and things like that, but it's really kind of providing Russia stability. So we got to think about how this, to interpret Russian public opinion, we have to think about how it differs from what we're used to in the West. So the way that things and opinions work in terms of voting in Western democracy, the primary driver is this idea of what have you done for me lately, the economic voting action, what the short-term achievements in terms of economics. In Russia, it's more like, will things get worse if Putin is removed? Mentality. So it has a performance element. So he has to deliver something to kind of deliver on stability. But it has a very different kind of logic to it. So there's this person with a poster here who says, if not Putin, then who? And that's not just a fabrication of like the regime propaganda and these kind of movements they create, but it's an actual sentiment. There is this mentality that a few authors found in other countries which were affected by deep crises. This mentality of better the devil you know than the saint you don't. So maybe you don't like the current incumbent, but at least he's a strong leader who's providing stability. We don't know what's going to happen. So what this does is makes the regime very resilient in the face of economic hardship, potentially. And even people who don't like the regime and despise it for various reasons like corruption, performance, and so on, can support it because they fear the attack. At the same time, the regime can quickly collapse if it's seen as weak, or an alternative that is seen as better. So that's kind of the major driving force here. So stability legitimation is really a double-edged sword in Russia. So as Huntington put it, regimes which are really legitimized on the premise and promise of restoring stability become redundant both when they succeed their mission of delivering stability and when they fail. If they succeed, why do we need a dictatorship? We're a stable democracy. We can move beyond this strongman. If they fail, of course, something else has to be in place. So they operate in a very narrow corridor. They must juggle two incompatible goals. For instance, they must sustain or even manufacture the threats and crises that justify the rules, or the trauma, if you like, that creates this public opinion sentiment that stabilizes, while also appearing to be successful in resolving crises. So it's kind of a difficult legitimation purpose they have. So let me show you what happened in this sense in terms of economic assessments and popular support for Putin. I'm drawing this from Daniel Treisman's analysis of how things worked in terms of economic links to popularity. So on the right axis, you have essentially economic sentiments, and on the left you have Putin's approval. So when you look at the dashed line here is approval, and the full line is positive minus negative appraisals of the Russian economy. So mind you, these are all negative, really until 2009. So this is the period of the era of stabilization. This exactly 2009, Putin has managed to bring Russia back to the real GDP levels of at the time of the Soviet collapse. This is what happened by that time. This is the era of stabilization. Then the 2009 recession hits, the global financial crisis, which hits Russia really hard. Things move in tandem for a while, but then economic sentiments and popular appeal and popular support for Putin really decouple. You see popularity, the dash line goes down the drain essentially during this period of the protest that Putin was facing, while economic sentiments improve. So the two decouple. So the end of the era of stabilization makes Russians, especially the middle class people that he created, walk away from him. The middle class, as he famously put it, turned against him because they reached a stage at which they saw the regime itself as an obstacle for further progress, the corruption of the regime, the authoritarianism. So they're going to have this attitude of, thank you very much for stabilizing Russia to this stage. Now please leave. And when he doesn't, really protest erupts when this alienated middle class sees that he intends to return rather than leave. So this is your kind of classical modernization theory reason for why things decoupled in 2008, in 21 and 22. So that's kind of how to distinguish essentially economic sentiments from Putin's popularity. They're not really driving this. It's really stability. When he stabilizes things economically, people really move away, especially the small ones in the population. When you look at the peaks and troughs of the Vladimir Putin's approval ratings, you see all the peaks are really worse. So the first one, which was this explosive rise in popularity, was the invasion of Chechnya, which really made the war with Georgia was another highlight in summer of 2008. And then the Crimea annexation was the biggest highlight. The troughs are really when he breaks the social contracts in terms of providing economic stability. 2005 monetization of benefits protests. When the regime tried to kind of withdraw some of the benefits affecting pensioners. Then the 2011-2012 protest wave coming from this decoupling of economic sentiments and regime support. And then most recently, the pension age extension protest, which again, it's because of the breaking of the social contract. So the 2005 monetization of benefits and the pension age extension protests really come from breaking, removing social stability welfare elements, not economic problems. So during the Crimea annexation, Russia's economy and sentiments about the economy were much lower than they were now and in 2005. It was just breaking the promise of economic stability, not economic growth. So this is kind of subtle difference, but essential. And we might ask the question, just to kind of start wrapping things up a bit, what does the future hold, given this context of how Russian public opinion and attitude towards Putin work? So I'll just mention a few key trends and maybe a few interpretations which I can expand on in the Q&A. So one, when you look at approval ratings, and I have here approval and disapproval in red, you see we've reached the lowest approval on record this month. It's 59%. We broke the 60% barrier. So Putin is now below 60% officially. And the gap between approval and disapproval is about 26%, which is about the same as after the protest wave in 2011, 2012, which was the biggest challenge to the Putin regime to date. So we are in unknown, uncharted territory in terms of the fragility of this popular support Putin system. Another one is even more, so approval is a kind of a yes-no question, in which people respond. There's like less depth in terms of understanding the depth of support, if you like. Another one is trust in Vladimir Putin. This has been a controversial figure recently. So the trust, we reached the lowest point on record. So, it's below 30% basically, population trust Putin. And it has the closest distrust gap in history. Not even during the period of a protest in 2011, 2013, distrust was so high. This gap was so close. Another interesting thing about this is when you see the source of this. And essentially, we'll just kind of look. This is SIOM actually. This is the government posting. So they are the ones producing this. If you're kind of concerned with the Levada Center, which I'm using the other data for, is driving this. Another one is the weakening of the authoritarian tools, and I'll wrap up pretty quickly and run through some of these slides so we just time. So Putin generation comes of age. This is a generation that hasn't lived through the 90s. Essentially, they don't remember. They don't remember the trauma of the 90s, and they're kind of more prone to protest. There is this growing anti-repression mood of the population. There is an increasing share of the population who thinks police action against election protests were excessive. They're against anti-libel laws and things like that. The Crimea effect has worn off. Now more people say, less people actually say that it brought more good than harm than in the past. It's less than 40%. And especially critical, the government loses its dominance over the media. So this graph shows where Russians get the news: television versus internet and social networks. So just recently, internet and social networks, which is associated with more opposition to the regime, really overtaken television, which is the main propaganda tool. So that's another kind of key thing. I'll just keep to this. So a couple of these slides I can go back to them, so we just keep time. The protest potential I wanted to mention. So protest potential exploded after the pension age extension. So just focusing on this red direction, would you personally take part in protests, the level? So Putin era average before 2018 was about 18%. Yeltsin era average was about less than 25%. The current average is over that. It's over the Yeltsin era average. This is economic protest, similar trend with political protest. So this is crucial. And I just wanted to end with one final graph here, which really asks the question, would you like to see Vladimir Putin as president of Russia after the end of his current presidential term? So blue is to, Putin to stay and red is to leave. This is what happened in 2012, 2013 period under protests. So you had more people demanding Putin to leave than to stay. And then Crimea happens and completely flips the trend. So more people, over 60%, want him to stay now, and then leave goes down. But after that, after especially he gets reelected in 2018, things begin to narrow down. Now we're at this crossing point when things might go back to the previous situation. So the capacity of the regime to renew itself when this is critical before the 2024 kind of change is getting depleted. So just really a quick summary, and I can expand it. I'll throw a lot in this slide. Can the regime last in this context? The straight answer is, you know, what Adam Przeworski kind of put up in '86, a long time ago. A regime doesn't collapse unless some alternative is organized in a way to present a real choice to isolated individuals. So it's really, the problem now is not the regime's weakness, but the weakness of the opposition. The second point I wanted to raise maybe for discussion is really mass protest is the key for constituting an alternative. The Russian opposition is too fragmented to kind of present anything in a different fashion, and really protest is a substitute for democratic politics in autocracy. The street is the only real opposition, and really parliament. So only protest can unify a polarized opposition in an anyone but Putin type of coalition. Really mobilize the dissatisfied apathetic majority, really turn apathy into anger. So protest is a key thing to watch. So the opposition is the key thing to watch, the protest is the key thing to watch. And how does the regime respond to this? I argue only large-scale conflicts have the reliable ability to demobilize protest. Have had that in the past and probably in the future. So I'll just close here so we can come to the question and answers.
Well, thank you so much, Alexander, for this great presentation. I will be moderating the discussion. We already have several questions appearing in the chat box, and I invite everybody having question to write your question or to raise your hand, and we will see if we can give you the floor, but we have 105 participants, so it may be difficult. So I would prefer to collect written question. To follow exactly on where you live, in a sense, there is a question about the parallel between trust in Putin and popularity of Putin and popularity of the lower trust in Putin could lead to a higher popularity of some figures of the opposition. So if you could develop on this kind of key aspect that you just finished on your last slide.
Right. Let me try, and I actually have a slide about what's the problem. It's kind of a little brutal, so excuse me if I take it in terms of kind of assessing the Russian opposition. The problem with the Russian opposition is when you think about it, you know, even analytically in a kind of fully rational frame of mind, it's kind of really hard to vote for them if you're a Russian kid. So like just I'll caricature this, and excuse me again. The problem with the Russian opposition is that they're all kind of essentially illegitimate in various ways. So just to show you the menu that you have in terms of voting in Russia. So you have the communists, you have the Democrats, so-called Democrats, and they come in various flavors, fairly fragmented. You have the nationalists, like Zhirinovsky here, and other people. And you have all of these kind of so-called systemic oppositions are associated with previous absolute disasters. The communists, you know, empty shelves, communist rule. So a lot of people still like them, but they cannot, you know, extend beyond their core supporters. Democrats, they're associated with the biggest decline in Russian history, the disaster of the 90s. So you know, they're really, again, can't extend beyond. Nationalists, quite frankly, are considered crazy. People don't vote for them, you know, for those reasons. So that leaves kind of the non-systemic opposition. and people like Navalny. The problem with them is there's the devil, better the devil you know than the saint you don't. These people are untested, and the people assessing them are a population which is essentially traumatized by a disaster when it tried something new in the 90s. So this is an especially apprehensive population to trust somebody new coming out of the blue. So it's really easy to delegitimize them with negative campaigns in the media and to make people uncertain about these people and essentially kind of keep them away. So it's really hard, like just if you think analytically, I don't know how you unify this. Something new has to happen. Everybody has to unite around a least common denominator type of situation, which might be, anybody but Putin. Let's just throw him out of office. Type of coalition, which is really hard to put together because you can't really make that coalition easily without mass public dissatisfaction. So that's kind of my short answer to this. They're too delegitimized or too untested to break through that barrier. Putin is life has made it easy for him because the whole spectrum of who you might choose in Russia was totally devastated by their previous record. So people are really essentially hateful of these choices too much, making life easier for him. Just give you a short answer. So they trust whatever distrust of Putin you might have, they distrust these guys more. Jesus.
Great. We have several questions about how the regime is manufacturing crisis. And so there are kind of two aspects of that. One, what do you think about the likelihood of Putin trying to manufacture another crisis like Crimea to try to regain popularity and maybe regain also kind of legitimize the constitutional changes that were planned until the pandemic's crisis arrived? And what about the role of state-sponsored media in manufacturing crisis?
Yeah, so as I kind of said with that extension of Huntington's idea, this is a regime that is legitimized when we're providing stability after a devastating crisis. So they kind of become redundant if there's no crisis. Even when things are going well, they become redundant. So if you look at Putin's popular support, again, as I said, the peaks are worse. And not only worse, the Crimea annexation managed to resuscitate the kind of a very rapidly decaying regime in 2013 when it was looking weak. It couldn't kind of clear the streets, and approval disapproval rating kind of got essentially closer. So this, in terms of what we've seen so far, it's really these wars that are the best way to resolve things. Again, when you look at this, would you vote for Putin for another term? Things were looking very bad in 2013. So red was we want Putin to leave. This is 13. And just look at what happens after annexation. Completely revives the regimes in this sense. So in terms of what happened before, if we looked at past, crises of this big scope like Ukraine are the only ones that can revive the regime in this sense. It also has a very interesting diversionary effects of conflict with people's approvals. I want to show you corruption, actually the effect of corruption here. So this one shows what problems do you consider the most serious. You have price increases, poverty, unemployment, economic crisis, corruption, and then war in the east of Ukraine shows. And then you have in gray the Putin's approval minus disapproval. So you see how it drops for a while, then picks up after the invasion of Ukraine here. And what you could notice is actually all these economic things like price increases, poverty, and so on. When you study the correlation with Putin's approval ratings, they will go in different directions. They're not the ones driving this. The only one consistent is corruption. When corruption goes up, corruption being a key concern of the population, Putin approval goes up. Now look what happens when the war in the east of Ukraine happens. You essentially have this rise. 28% of the people are concerned about the war, and the corruption concerns go down, and Putin's ratings go up. Then a few years later, after February 2015 and February 2016, you see the interest in the war in Ukraine goes down, corruption goes a few inches up, and then people's approval goes down. So really another kind of indicator to look is corruption, like directly people going against the regime, turning their backs. It's really corruption rather than how worried about corruption. And the conflicts really have a great, sidelining effect. They're pushing away corruption concerns when there's a war going on. In terms of the types of wars, so there's a lot of discussion about Syria. Libya now is being kind of picked up as a potential conflict. There's just news about Russian warplanes deploying there under kind of different insignia. These are not making the cut. These are conflicts that don't excite the Russian population. So this has to be close to it. So the only wars that were inside Russia, like Chechnya, or in the kind of close neighborhood, where there's an emotional like Ukraine, I don't know, Belarus perhaps, are making the cut for this. Again, I'm not assessing the capacity of the regime to start another Ukraine-like scenario war, but in terms of public opinion, this is what's the only kind of thing that helps move things around. In terms of state media, it's an essential tool, but people don't just buy propaganda like that. You have to have enough reality for propaganda to work. So you have to have a real war, if you like. They just can't manufacture something out of the blue. You have to give them some fodder for that. So there needs to be a real thing. Again, this is kind of a large topic, just a kind of a really quick answer here. So.
If we want to continue the discussion on the relationship between trust in Putin and the kind of societal problems, what do you think? Any kind of new social contract that is available for the to kind of legitimize its rule, and how do you think, and that's related to what is happening now, how do you think the system has or hasn't enough resources to navigate the economic crisis that is kind of deepening now with the pandemics? So two kind of related questions on the resources to manage economic crisis and a new social contract that maybe could be linked to, I don't know, public spending, public health, given what is happening now.
Yeah, so the problem one is they already kind of a bit of that train has left the station, if you like, because there's already a shock in terms of the regime's capacity to handle it. So like investing in health now, I'm not sure how much is going to improve things in terms of public perception. The disaster has already happened in a lot of ways. Second problem is I don't know how much resources they have, and it appears the regime is really not ready to go and spend. They have this 500 billion. Rainy day fund, or actually various rainy day funds combined together, 500 billion that they could be spending. They're not actually. They're kind of really frugal, and they've shown that they're frugal in 2014 when prices were exploding after sanctions. They really let kind of standards of living go down the drain rather than intervene with the money they had saved for rainy day. So they're actually ready. So far, they have been at least ready to let the population suffer rather than spend their rainy day funds, believing they can handle this with repression. So, things are not looking well in the direction they are willing to do this or that they can do this. It's really hard to see how they'll make a turnaround and bring back the old reformist Putin of the early 2000s. People believe he's going to modernize Russia, make it a Western country, improve standards of living. And people are already disbelieving of his capacity to do that. So even if there is some improvement, the increase in terms of public support is probably going to be lower. So the scope for economic miracles, or even when you have miracles to make major effects on public opinion, are more limited, to give you kind of a short answer, than what they were before. So I wouldn't think that's the primary solution here. And again, I'm really skeptical how much scope they have to do.
Yeah, we have question also in a sense related to what is happening now about the fact that Putin's approval has fallen below governor's approval in March 2020, and with the kind of regionalization or decentralization going on with the pandemics currently, could you give your perspective on this kind of balance between Putin as the kind of national figure and the governor image, or the kind of region of regional authorities, and maybe how it can be affected by the crisis now because the governors are kind of in charge of the pandemics?
Yeah, so there's been a lot of articles written about his abstention now, and he's kind of their election in some more critical articles, like he's withdrawing and letting the governors take the pandemic. I think that's more a function of Putin not wanting to be exposed to the fallout than any kind of strategic juggling. I'm sure governors really don't want to deal with this. They're just trusting upfront, so they get the blame when things go wrong. It's more a function of this deflection of blame strategy than any systemic shift or tectonic shift going on. It's actually interesting to look at the succession scenarios here and the popular opinion reflections in terms of what's going on in the elite, if you're thinking in this sense. So it's actually useful to remind ourselves what the scenarios were before Putin opted for this extension of terms in office for him. And so there were a couple of scenarios here that were put forward. And really the primary one for Putin was this president of a union between Russia and Belarus. This was thing that was in the works in kind of November, December of last year. So this is an old trick, if you like. So Belarus and Russia have been in negotiations to create a union since the 90s. And this would have been a very neat maneuver, essentially allowing Putin to become a president of a new union, a larger state. So he has this, Putin the unifier legitimation narrative to it, which would have kind of have this idea, which would be like a conquest, if you like, an appeal to a post-Crimea legitimacy as a restorer of Russian lands. But this failed because Lukashenko of Belarus calculated he's going to lose out under the scenario. And Putin was not powerful and influential enough with his neighbor to kind of move things around. The next was the Chinese-Kazakh scenario, if you like. Essentially, Putin stepping back, becoming the head of a newly empowered Security Council and weakening the president. And this was, the elder statesman legitimation narrative. So he would kind of, like the Chinese were doing this every 10 years, they would shift their leadership, like, essentially Deng Xiaoping's model, 10 years, and then you have a new leadership taking over. And the old leader slowly fades away while a new one takes over. So this it maintains the pretense of democratic process. Like he's stepping back, he's keeping his promise that he's going to leave politics, but also signals confidence that Putin can control the elite. Because if you are stepping away from the presidential post, this creates problems potentially. If the president misbehaves, and we've seen hints of that with Medvedev, who was very weak but still resisted politics. So the regime is not confident enough to do that. It was really the most shocking thing for me in the last months was really when he decided to reset the presidential terms. Essentially, it looks like a strong move, but it signals a fundamental weakness and lack of confidence to control the, including the governors and various regional power brokers. In a lot of ways, if he doesn't have that institutional kind of core central position, and gives the opposition ammunition. They call them Timpa dictator, an African-style dictator in this scenario. So it's kind of the Putin, the indispensable legitimation right now, and it shows a fundamental weakness in terms of their own perceived ability to control elites. So this kind of maybe taps into what's Stephen Holmes called, the problem under Putinism for Russia is not that it pretends to be a democracy, but it actually pretends to be an autocracy, a strong autocracy. And Putin kind of holding on the reins as if they're dear to his dear life, kind of shows that he cannot step away and reliably control the situation.
If I can come in fact on that kind of succession discussion, do you think that how they will be voted or how there would be a thing on with the pandemics, do you think that could boost the disconnect between the regime and the society? Do you think that depending the way this constitutional amendment would be voted, the society react in kind of taking more distance toward the regime, or do you think it's just it will not impact them?
Yeah, so it's interesting because it's happening in this unprecedented coronavirus situation. We don't know, they'll be probably easing out restrictions and things might blow up later. So the last I heard, they're thinking about doing it in August. August is the quietest, the choice of the month August in Russia, all the things happen in August and deliberately because everybody is not home and like things can happen without any public interference, if you like. So the choice of the month is interesting if that happened, and it really jives well with support for the proposed constitutional changes, so like this extending the terms of office. So this is a question asked by the Levada surveys. Would you support the changes in the Constitution in a referendum? This is from April 2020, so from last month. So you have support, oppose, and hard to say. So if people are forced to vote, like if the respondents, despite of their preferences to vote, have to vote, you have very weakly looking support for this. Only 47% would support the change versus 31% would oppose it. So this is very measly support. So this is for a regime who's used to win super majorities in elections, let alone these constitutional movements. So this is pretty bad. It becomes interesting when you break it down by intention to vote. So certain unlikely voters have a much higher rate of supporting. About 58% of likely voters, who are about 55% of the population, would support it. Then uncertain voters, things drop down significantly. And people who say they will not vote, this 56% oppose it versus only 18% support. So what the regime would be hoping to push this through is really low turnout and I guess high falsification, which definitely has the potential to push people in the streets. Now, if they do it in the midst of the pandemic, that's going to be dampened down. But they might get it through in the short run with higher numbers, but the explosion is going to follow later because this is going to be internalized as a kind of grievance by the population.
Great. To continue on something that you mentioned previously, you mentioned that what was happening in Syria and now in Libya doesn't really have any impact on the public opinion because people are not specifically interested by foreign policy issues except when. And so we have question about how do you think the Russians are looking at European and US polarization and the rise of kind of illiberal populist far-right movement. And this maybe the broader question is that this feeling that suddenly maybe the West is no more what it was before or what could have been dreamed of, that it looks now more gloomy, more polarized with the Europe and US are managing it is not great. This kind of fallen dream of the West as a solution, how do you think that could impact the public opinion and in a sense reinforce Putin as being like, well, at least we have what we have in Russia, but the West is not doing very well neither.
Yeah. Thanks for that question. Excuse me. So yeah, definitely the West has lost a bit of its shine in terms of being the attractive alternative here. But it's not clear whether that's affecting this protest dynamic. Keep in mind, the people, you shouldn't expect if there is a protest and some kind of currently unlikely scenario, the regime gets toppled, that the people who will be protesting would be liberal Democrats. I would argue in terms of people who can threaten Putin, the biggest danger for him is really nationalist appeal. Essentially people in the nationalist camp, on which he really relies on heavily with the shift towards a kind of Crimea-like people being responsible, the legitimation scenario. If they see him as kind of somebody as a traitor, if he kind of makes a concession, doesn't push for Russian interest in various ways. And these are people who are also angry about corruption. So I don't know, take Navalny, for instance. Navalny, I'm not sure if I count him as a liberal or a Democrat. So some authors called him a younger, fresher version of Putin. So he's kind of quite nationalistic. He's quite populist, opportunistic. So you shouldn't assume that a shift from Putin is going to result in democracy. So if you start from that starting point, then the West losing its shine doesn't kind of slow down perhaps the protest element in Russia. In many ways, it might actually accelerate it because you have this domestic, opposition, if you like, of its own identity, not one that looks to kind of imitate the West, but one that is really tackling kind of specific problems of the regime: corruption, lack of health, providing healthcare, especially in the pandemic now, kind of specific issues that are not related to regime, like kind of previous models of protests and regime conflicts that have happened before. So you shouldn't assume that like the West losing its kind of attraction would affect that. In terms of the problems, the populism in the Western countries, so definitely the regime is benefiting from this lack of bandwidth, if you like, in the West for dealing with Russia. So they're not being pushed by Western powers to be more democratic and so on. So, you know, as long as that lasts, and it looks like the West will be distracted for quite a while, given its own problems, they'll kind of benefit from it, for sure.
Mm-hmm. Great. And the last two questions, and I will ask them in once. Go back to the plans on voting for the referendum. Could you explain, so it's quite a specific question, could you explain the strong correlation between Russian with a low likelihood to vote? And do you think that there is a feeling of retaliation, possibly, or how do you explain this strong correlation? And more broadly, what about this feeling that Putin has lost the connection to real people, and that's the management of the crisis now? You already partly answered the question, but there are kind of a lot of interest for that. This feeling that Putin has lost the connection to real people, and the way the pandemic is managed now could suddenly potentially maybe let some governor or regional figures like kind of emerging and building their own popularity. So if you could briefly conclude on these two questions.
Right, sure. So like in terms of the, so I guess answering the referendum question is maybe best from the perspective of the strategy of the potential strategy of the opposition. So what would you do as the opposition? Do you show up and say vote against, or do you boycott? From last I heard the Navalny seems to be kind of weakened for a lot of these non-systemic oppositionists, is we should boycott this. We should completely drive down turnout, make them falsify as much as they can. So that's one alternative, and it doesn't seem as an unviable. We make it even less legitimate than what they're trying to do. They'll have a really hard time mobilizing people for this, and the only way they could do it is through complete fraud. So essentially, they'll frame when this happens in August, if it does happen in August, will be boycotting the referendum will make it even less, even less legitimate than what it is. So then kind of build up this grievance in the long run. It also circumvents this requirement by the opposition to mobilize. They'll have a hard time mobilizing a no vote in the pandemic. So I think it's kind of a smart move to just move that, given resources and like how easily you could achieve it by doing this in terms of the referendum. In terms of the lost connection and the ability for someone to rise here, I'm not sure whether we should be looking for someone rather than a broad coalition that might be unified against anyone but people. Some protest exploding over some issue, people showing up in the city squares for an election or whatever, and then a broad kind of band of coalitions, even maybe parts of some people who are in government, even governors, joining this anyone but Putin type of situation. So in a way, maybe one kind of informative element is actually to look at the Yeltsin. So when Yeltsin's popularity started going down, how governors started banding together with opposition figures in Moscow and starting to look for their thing. I don't think we're there yet. Putin's regime is going to be more brutal in dealing with these challenges, I think, as well. But it's more like looking at coalitions rather than individuals, because individuals are in a way easier to deal with in various ways. When you have a coalition, it's usually unexpected. It's coming out of this, usually protest, which is hard to predict. You should probably look at themes, like the idea to vote for. I think they call it smart voting. Navalny called it smart voting. So these initiatives to pull together anyone but Putin type of coalitions in various regional and central level elections are more important indicators of this emergence of a potential second alternative rather than a specific person or governor or even somebody defecting from the system.
Great. Okay, well, I think with that, it will be time for us to conclude. We already have our 1 hour It was really great. We could have continued for, of course, very long, given the topics and the great research you have been doing on that. So wanted to thank you, Alexander, for being with us today. We wish you all good in your move to this new job in Monterrey in a few weeks, and I wanted to thank all our attendees also, and please join us also on Friday. We will have another event looking at something we discussed today, the regional responses to the COVID-19 crisis and how the regime is managing them at the regional level. And so once again, Alexander, thank you so much, and wishing you all the best. And to all of you, please stay all safe and at home. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. This was a great opportunity. And again, keep following Russia. Will never get bored.
Exactly. Thank you. Bye-bye.